The next speaker is a friend of ours and is a respondent to Bob, and his name is Frank Scutaro. He's an historian. He's the author of a book called President Grant Reconsidered, and he is the person responsible for the cleanup of the Grant Memorial over here near Riverside Church. Without him, that would not have been done. There's a whole story behind that. We won't worry about going into that right now. And so I'd like to have you join me in welcoming Frank Scaturo, author of President Grant Reconsidered. Frank?
Well, thanks so much for the kind introduction, for the invitation, and let me apologize in advance if I wind up leaving before the panel is concluded, as I have a family commitment to make on eastern Long Island, Suffolk County, at 3:45. I wanted to follow the last presentation, where I think it is appropriate. There has been a new consideration of the role of the slavery issue in debates among the Founding Fathers. I want to jump ahead to what many call, I think appropriately, the Second American Revolution, of Civil War, Reconstruction, and what happened when the slavery issue, of course, came to that ultimate resolution and a redefinition of our constitutional order in the form of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and to talk about that specifically with reference to our 18th president, U.S. Grant. Now, I don't know where the saying comes from that history is written by the winners, because that's certainly not true of the Civil War. And no one's story better illustrates that than the principal author of Union victory during that war. Given that he went on to serve 8 years in the White House, Grant could claim to have been unsurpassed as a leader of the Civil War Reconstruction era, because remember, Lincoln tragically only made it until 1865 with his assassination. And Grant, it's often forgotten, was regarded in his time as the equal of both Washington and Lincoln. But something happened to Grant in the 20th century that did not happen to Washington or Lincoln. He was dismissed in many circles as a butcher of a general, and even more unanimously as a poor president, second only in some presidential historians' polls to rock-bottom Warren Harding. Henry Adams, who was revered as perhaps the greatest American historian, famously wrote that Grant should have been extinct for ages, and that the progress of evolution from President Washington to President Grant was alone evidence enough to upset Darwin. Now, later historians, unfortunately, enthusiastically carried that torch. William Heseltine, who wrote the definitive study of Grant's presidency in 1935, asserted that Grant was peculiarly ignorant of the Constitution. He wrote his mental endowment was not great. And Alan Nevins, who wrote what I think is the second most definitive account of Grant's presidency 1 year later, claimed that Grant had a vast ignorance of civil affairs, economics, and history. H.L. Mencken once remarked that it would have been worth losing the Civil War if that would have spared the nation Grant's presidency. So what happened? I mean, in my view, most historians through the 20th century got it wrong, and they've only recently begun to correct the record. I want to start with some background. Although those who knew U.S. Grant in his pre-Civil War life attested to his personal discomfort with the institution of slavery, one neighbor referred to it as a source of shame to him. No one could call him anti-slavery by any sense of the term, because he did marry into a slaveholding family. But his development on this issue, on the issue of race, was really remarkable. On August 30th of 1863, Grant wrote the following to Congressman Elihu Washburn of Illinois. He wrote, "I never was an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery. But I try to judge fairly and honestly, and it became patent to my mind early in the rebellion that the North and South could never live at peace with each other except as one nation, and that without slavery. As anxious as I am to see peace reestablished, I would not therefore be willing to see any settlement until this question is forever settled. 15 years later, during his trip around the world, Grant had this remarkable exchange with German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck asked him, this is in 1878, Bismarck said to Grant, "What always seemed so sad to me about your last great war was that you were fighting your own people. That is always so terrible in wars, so very hard." Grant replied, "But it had to be done." Bismarck responded, "Yes, you had to save the Union just as we had to save Germany." Grant responds, "Not only save the Union, but destroy slavery." Bismarck continues, "I suppose, however, the Union was the real sentiment, the dominant sentiment." And Grant responds, "In the beginning, yes, but as soon as slavery fired upon the flag, it was felt. We all felt, even those who did not object to slaves, that slavery must be destroyed. We felt that it was a stain to the Union that men should be bought and sold like cattle." Now, after Appomattox, the slaves were free, but many in the South exerted every effort that they could to reduce the former slaves to a status that virtually was slavery, even though it may not have borne that name. The former Confederate states passed what were known as the Black Codes. These were state laws that sharply limited the economic choices of former slaves and limited white competition for the labor of the black workers in the South. Former Confederates were unapologetic about their defense of slavery during the Civil War. They were unapologetic about the rebellion itself, and it certainly showed. The Black Codes enforced plantation discipline. It punished those who failed to contract, and the result came so close to slavery that there was a revolt against this in Congress, quite understandably. In 1866, a Republican-led Congress passed, among other measures, a Civil Rights Act that guaranteed to former slaves all of these rights that were being taken away. And they spelled them out: the right to make and enforce contracts, to sue, to be parties, to give evidence, to inherit, purchase, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to enjoy the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of persons and property. Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated, vetoed this and basically every other civil rights measure that was proposed during that period, but the Republicans gained a sizable enough majority in the 1866 elections to push these measures over his veto. They also pushed, and constitutional amendments, of course, don't require presidential approval, but very significantly, that Congress also pushed and approved the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which, among other things, offers the guarantee of equal protection of the laws. Now, the intensity of the ongoing battle between the president and Congress made this one of the most politically dysfunctional periods in American history. Johnson would be impeached, he would escape removal from office by one vote, and he would remain in limbo during his last year in office. His defiance of federal intervention in the South encouraged many former Confederates to continue their resistance to the advancement of the civil rights, and radical Republicans in Congress, who are the driving force behind civil rights, established a program of temporary military reconstruction in the South that still existed in 3 states at the time of Johnson's retirement. Now, at this point, Grant, General-in-Chief, members of the Army, had become privately disillusioned with President Johnson, and he came to sympathize with the radicals. One myth about Grant the politician was that he entered the presidency with no political experience. But in fact, as General-in-Chief, Grant was deeply involved in the national issues that were sweeping the country. He was frequently consulted during the preparation of Reconstruction legislation, and he essentially was charged by Congress with the responsibility of supervising Reconstruction's implementation. This was an awkward position, to say the least, given Johnson's opposition to Reconstruction laws, and by 1868, Grant was the most popular man in the country, and he was urged to run for president. Now, although Grant once told his friend, General William Sherman, that he did not want to become president, even if he were paid $50 million to do so, he said that amount of money could not compensate me to do this, he had to add that by this point he had a strong desire to protect what he viewed as the full meaning of Union victory during the Civil War. He accepted the Republican nomination for president in 1868 with a letter that ended, "Let us have peace," which now stands as the epitaph at Grant's tomb. If you look at some of the campaign literature that came out during that time, it is chilling to see what major party candidates were willing to say. But there was a campaign poster by Grant's opponent, the Democratic nominee, Horatio Seymour, former governor of New York, said, "This is our motto. This is a white man's country. Let white men rule." You cannot overstate how polarized the country was at this time, and of course on this very fundamental issue of freedom. Yet in few traditional accounts of Grant's presidency will you account any effort to recount the facts of his administration. Most of what you will read more closely resembles the bitter critiques of Grant's most partisan enemies, the so-called reformers of his time, who criticized him, usually through a string of platitudes, and suggested that he had a corrupt administration. And as it turns out, if you look at the facts, it's very hard to pin corruption, or at least any distinctive level of corruption, to Grant directly or indirectly. He was himself so honest, and as honest, I would say, a president as we've ever had. His Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, once said that the man could not tell a lie if he had written it down beforehand. But it's also significant that he never stood by a subordinate, and there were actually very few who faced credible charges of corruption. Among his cabinet, there was really just one who had a rock-solid, against whom you could say it was a rock-solid case for corruption, and that was his Secretary of War, William Belknap, who was quite quickly dismissed from Grant's cabinet. And the more you look at Grant's presidency, the more you see that the so-called corruption issue is merely one side of a coin. The other side of the coin, without which the anti-Grant reformers, and frankly most of the history that was passed down through the 20th century, cannot be understood, is the issue of Reconstruction. Reformers were tired of Reconstruction by 1872, and they wanted the nation to move on to seemingly more important issues. For them, Reconstruction was all a part of the corruption that they condemned, and a consensus that developed among historians for much of the 20th century adhered to this notion lockstep. C. Vann Woodward called Grant's Reconstruction policy the most conspicuous example of corruption during Grant's terms in office, and William Dunning charged Grant with an utter lack of ability to judge men for no other reason that he had allied himself with radical rather than moderate Republicans. The so-called Dunning School, founded by Professor Dunning at Columbia University in the early 20th century, bears primary responsibility for condemning Reconstruction as this terrible attempt to confer the benefits of citizenship on a race that was thought unworthy to exercise them. In Dunning's words, the ultimate root of the trouble in the South had been not the institution of slavery, but the coexistence in one society of two races so distinct in characteristics as to render coalescence impossible. Dunning's professor, his colleague rather, at Columbia, Professor John Burgess, who still has a library named after him at Columbia, outdid Dunning in bluntness, saying that under notions of sound political science, the imposition of universal Negro suffrage upon the Southern communities was one of the blunder crimes of the century. He continued, "There is something natural in the subordination of an inferior race to a superior race, even to the point of the enslavement of the inferior race, but there is nothing natural in the opposite." These sorts of racialist views were the foundation, they were the premise of the history of Reconstruction that was casually handed down, and often times unknowingly handed down by the average grammar and high school history professors. And it even applied when I was going to grammar in high school during the 1980s. And it's not surprising when you consider this movement in the history books that someone like Grant would infuriate historians who held such views. In his first term in office, Grant engaged in the arm twisting that was necessary, even acting to return Georgia to temporary military rule after Democrats in that state removed 5 black legislatures in order to ensure the successful ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. That's the amendment that prohibits discrimination based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Grant broke from precedent and he issued a proclamation celebrating the ratification of the 15th Amendment, calling this measure a measure of grander importance than any other one act of its kind from the foundation of our government to the present day. And Reconstruction saw a bunch of groundbreaking precedents, including the rise to office of African Americans to several significant offices, including the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, and even briefly governor for the first time in U.S. history. Additionally, Grant pushed 5 what were known as enforcement acts through Congress to enable the federal government to protect 14th Amendment rights and the newly conferred voting rights of the 15th Amendment that arose during Reconstruction. He also signed the act creating the Justice Department, which was the single greatest consolidation of the government's legal enforcement power. At this time, groups like the Ku Klux Klan were doing all they could to crush the voting rights of former slaves through terrorist tactics, through rampant violence. And in 1871, Grant invoked the most controversial of the enforcement acts, which was known as the Ku Klux Klan Act, when he moved to suspend habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties in response to the Klan violence. This was followed by a prosecution that by 1872 led to the extinction of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan that exists today actually was started around 1915, but the Reconstruction era Klan was crushed. Now, despite this, of course, there were other groups, other white supremacist groups that came up that employed more subtle means to try to suppress the political and civil rights of former slaves. Grant, regardless of the pressure that came to mount to turn his back on Reconstruction, really stood his course. He won a landslide election in 1872, which I think it's significant to note. And I'm not the first one to say this. It's actually been stated by several historians, including James McPherson and Eric Foner, that the election of 1872 was probably the most democratic election in our country's history until 1968, because of the tragic backsliding on civil rights that occurred during the intervening 9 decades. During Grant's second term, Reconstruction became a tremendous problem, not because of just the recalcitrance of Southerners, of former Confederates. That had always been a problem. But now, as the country faced the mid-1870s, it was Northerners who turned adamantly against Reconstruction, and they demanded an end to it. And in a lot of the literature of the time, you see the racism that still plagued pretty much the entire population, the entire white population of the time. When President Grant, tried to show restraint in the use of military force, the white supremacist forces then responded by trying to take advantage. So Grant found himself employing federal troops, using federal troops in a number of occasions to protect the voting rights and the other civil rights of the former slaves. He even advanced his agenda another step at the time the country was turning its back on it. In his second inaugural address, Grant called for another Civil Rights Act, and Congress responded in 1875 with the Civil Rights Act of that year, which prohibited discrimination, racial discrimination, in public accommodations and transportation. So theaters, inns, streetcars, other public conveyances and accommodations were prohibited from employing racial discrimination. This is a remarkable thing when you consider that this is 89 years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we tend to assume was the first time that our federal government ever did anything like this. No, it happened before, and the reason we don't hear about the 1875 Civil Rights Act, in addition to the Dunning School that I just described to you, is that as the country was turning its back on Reconstruction, the Supreme Court, going into the 1880s, employed its own rewriting of the Constitution against the meaning imparted to the 14th and 15th Amendments by those who had very recently framed these amendments. And they said, well, in fact, they found a contorted rationalization in an 1883 case called a decision called the Civil Rights Cases, for why Congress did not have the power to pass the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And you could be sure several of the surviving framers of that law, who had also been in Congress to vote in favor of the 14th Amendment, voiced their protest to that decision. But the country was on its backslide against Reconstruction. What happened after Grant left office? He wound up being replaced by Rutherford B. Hayes, who withdrew the last remaining federal troops that existed to enforce Reconstruction. But during his time in the White House, even as the country was turning against this experiment in democracy and this attempt to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence, Grant was an eloquent spokesman for racial equality, and he reached a level that was not to be seen, never was seen before in the presidency, and it was not to be seen again until the mid-20th century. In his first year in the White House, he stated that the present difficulty in bringing all parts of the United States to a happy unity and love of country grows out of the prejudice to color, making Grant the first president to address the issue of racism head-on. He added the successful appeals that I mentioned to you for civil rights. And then during his second term, when public opinion was swinging against him, Grant stated in his annual message of 1874, he said, "Let there be fairness in the discussion of Southern questions, condemning the wrong and upholding the right. Treat the Negro as a citizen and a voter, as he is and must remain. Then we shall have no complaint of sectional interference." And then shortly after his presidency, early in his trip around the world that I referenced earlier, Grant stated, "Suffrage once given can never be taken away, and all that remains for us now is to make good that gift by protecting those who have yet received it." But once Grant was out of office, even though he was succeeded by a president of the same party, the reversal of Reconstruction was well on its way. And the Supreme Court's interment of the 1875 Civil Rights Act that occurred in 1883 would be followed by a wave of new laws in the former Confederate states that actually required racial segregation in public accommodations and transportation. And of course, as so many of you know, that led to a Supreme Court decision in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the court contorted its own rationale for how, well, this is okay because although these facilities are separate, they're also but equal. And separate but equal thus entered the constitutional lexicon until it was undone 58 years later. At the time of Grant's death, in 1885, Frederick Douglass had this to say: "To Grant, more than to any other man, the Negro owes his enfranchisement and the Indian a humane policy. In the matter of the protection of the freedmen from violence, his moral courage surpassed that of his party. Hence, his place at its head was given to timid men, and the country was allowed to drift instead of stemming the current with stalwart arms." If we're ever going to understand the presidency, we need to get Grant's presidency right. Otherwise, we will be at a loss to understand the basic about presidential leadership, both in its potential and in its limitations. Thanks so much.